On the morning of July 1st, 1916, at precisely 0728 hours, Private Harold Wickham positioned himself behind a Lewis gun equipped with a magazine that no standard British Army inventory included, no official procurement order had authorized, and no factory had manufactured to military specifications. The circular pan magazine mounted atop his weapon measured nearly 50 centimeters in diameter and contained 100.303 British cartridges arranged in a spiral feeding pattern that required mechanical tolerances exceeding anything the standard 47-round magazine demanded. The chalky soil of the Somme would soon become the testing ground for a weapon modification born from desperate necessity and the recognition that existing magazine capacity was catastrophically inadequate for the combat about to commence. At 23 years of age, Wickham had already served 9 months on the Western Front and operated the Lewis gun through 4 major engagements that had taught him the weapon's capabilities and, more critically, its limitations. He had trained on the Lewis at a depot in England during early 1915, where instructors had emphasized the weapon's revolutionary design features, its air-cooled barrel, its top-mounted pan magazine, and its relative lightness compared to belt-fed machine guns that required dedicated crews and substantial logistical support. The standard Lewis gun magazine held 47 rounds of .303 British ammunition in a circular pan that measured approximately 27 centimeters in diameter. The feeding mechanism utilized a spiral track machined into the magazine's interior surface, with cartridges arranged in a continuous spiral from the magazine's outer edge toward the center. A clock spring provided the mechanical force necessary to advance cartridges through the spiral track toward the feed lips, where the rifle's action stripped rounds and chambered them for firing. The 47-round capacity represented a significant increase over the standard infantry rifle's 10-round magazine, providing Lewis gunners with sustained fire capability that could suppress enemy positions for several seconds before requiring a magazine change. However, 9 months of combat experience had convinced Wickham and thousands of other Lewis gunners that 47 rounds was woefully insufficient for the sustained suppressive fire that modern combat demanded. The mathematical reality was brutally simple. The Lewis gun fired at a cyclic rate of approximately 550 rounds per minute, though practical rates accounting for trigger control and heat management typically ranged between 400 and 450 rounds per minute. A 47-round magazine provided roughly 6 seconds of continuous fire at practical rates, after which the gunner had to remove the empty magazine, retrieve a loaded replacement, mount it on the weapon, and resume firing, a process requiring between 8 and 12 seconds, even for experienced crews. The 18-second cycle time, 6 seconds firing, 12 seconds reloading, meant that Lewis gunners spent more time changing magazines than actually firing during sustained engagements. The limitation proved particularly acute during defensive operations, where German attacks required continuous suppressive fire to prevent enemy forces from closing to assault range. A Lewis gun position defending against an attack might expand 8 to 12 magazines during a critical 3-minute engagement, with the gunner and his assistant spending more than half that time frantically changing magazines while enemy soldiers advanced under reduced fire. British tactical doctrine attempted to address this limitation through coordinated fire between multiple Lewis guns positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. While one gun reloaded, adjacent weapons maintained fire, theoretically preventing gaps in the defensive coverage.
This approach worked adequately when sufficient weapons were available and properly positioned, but casualties, equipment failures, and the chaos of combat frequently disrupted the coordination that the doctrine required. The experimental 100-round magazine that Wickham now prepared to employ represented an attempt to solve this fundamental capacity problem through mechanical rather than tactical means. If a single magazine could provide 12 seconds of continuous fire instead of 6, the reloading cycle would shift from 18 seconds to approximately 24 seconds. But the proportion of time spent firing would increase from 33% to 50%, dramatically improving the weapon's sustained fire capability. The enlarged magazine had been fabricated by artificers attached to the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, working from a design concept proposed by a captain in the Machine Gun Corps who had served at Loos during 1915. The captain's after-action report following that battle had documented the magazine capacity problem in detail, providing statistical analysis of ammunition expenditure rates, reload cycle times, and the tactical consequences of sustained fire interruptions during critical defensive engagements. The report had reached the Small Arms Committee in London during December 1915, where it joined dozens of other field modification proposals submitted by officers who had identified equipment deficiencies during combat operations. The committee's response had been characteristically cautious, noting that increasing magazine capacity would increase magazine weight, potentially degrading the Lewis gun's portability advantage over belt-fed weapons. The committee requested additional analysis before authorizing any formal development program. However, several Royal Army Ordnance Corps artificers with access to the report had begun experimenting with enlarged magazines on their own initiative, working during off-duty hours in workshops behind the front lines. The technical challenge was substantial but not insurmountable for skilled machinists with access to adequate tools and materials. The spiral feeding track required precision machining to ensure reliable cartridge advancement, and the clock spring required careful selection to provide adequate force throughout the magazine's capacity without overstressing the feeding mechanism. The first experimental 100-round magazine had been completed in March 1916 in a workshop near Arras. Initial testing revealed numerous feeding problems as the spring force proved inadequate to reliably advance cartridges through the extended spiral track. The artificer who had built the magazine, a sergeant major with 15 years of peacetime armorer experience, modified the spring design 3 times before achieving reliable feeding through the magazine's full capacity. The modified spring generated significantly higher forces than the standard 47-round magazine spring, requiring stronger materials for the magazine body to prevent deformation under the increased stress. The sergeant major fabricated the enlarged magazine body from steel plate slightly thicker than standard magazines, increasing durability but also increasing weight. The completed 100-round magazine weighed approximately 4.8 kilograms when fully loaded, compared to 2.2 kilograms for a standard magazine, more than doubling the weight that the gunner had to manipulate during magazine changes. Wickham had received his experimental magazine on June 25th, 6 days before the planned offensive on the Somme. The weapon had arrived with minimal documentation, a brief note indicating that it was an experimental design, that it should be employed only if the tactical situation justified the risk of potential malfunction, and that detailed reports of its performance should be forwarded through channels following any combat employment.
Wickham had test-fired the weapon during the final days before the offensive, expending approximately 200 rounds to familiarize himself with its handling characteristics and confirm reliable feeding. The enlarged magazine altered the Lewis gun's balance substantially, with the additional weight positioned high and forward of the action. The weapon felt distinctly top-heavy compared to the standard configuration, requiring additional muscular effort to maintain stable aim during sustained fire. The magazine's physical size created clearance concerns when firing from prone positions or from positions with overhead cover. The 50-centimeter diameter meant the magazine extended nearly 10 centimeters beyond each side of the rifle's receiver, creating additional width that could contact terrain or obstacles during weapon manipulation.
Wickham noted in his section's informal log that the enlarged magazine made the weapon noticeably more awkward to maneuver in confined spaces, though the capacity advantage might justify the handling compromises during sustained defensive engagements. The British offensive on the Somme commenced at 7:30 hours on July 1st with the detonation of massive mine explosions beneath German positions, followed immediately by the advance of British infantry across no man's land toward the German trenches. Wickham's section was positioned in a support trench approximately 400 meters behind the front line, tasked with providing suppressive fire against German positions that might threaten the advancing British infantry. The tactical plan called for Wickham's Lewis gun to deliver sustained fire against identified German machine gun positions, forcing their crews to take cover and reducing their effectiveness against the British attack. The firing position had been prepared during the previous night, with sandbags arranged to provide protection while allowing adequate traverse across the designated target area. Wickham had positioned 6 standard 47-round magazines within easy reach, along with the single experimental 100-round magazine that he had decided to employ first. The weight of the loaded 100-round magazine became immediately apparent as Wickham lifted it to mount on the weapon. The 4.8-kilogram mass required both hands to maneuver safely, and seating it on the mounting spindle demanded more care than the lighter standard magazines. The magazine's diameter meant that Wickham's line of sight was partially obstructed when looking to either side, creating blind spots that did not exist with standard magazines. At 7:32 hours, Wickham observed muzzle flashes from a German machine gun position approximately 350 meters distant, firing on the advancing British infantry who was struggling through wire obstacles in no man's land. He settled his aim on the German position, accounting for range and the slight crosswind that would affect bullet trajectory, and pressed the trigger. The Lewis gun roared to life, sending .303 rounds downrange at approximately 7 rounds per second. Wickham fired in controlled bursts of 10 to 15 rounds, allowing brief pauses between bursts to observe impact and adjust aim. The German position was partially obscured by its own fortifications, but Wickham could observe dust and debris kicked up by his rounds striking the sandbag positions surrounding the German gun. At 12 seconds of cumulative firing time, approximately 84 rounds expended, Wickham paused to allow his barrel to cool slightly and to reassess the tactical situation. The German machine gun had ceased firing, its crew either suppressed by Wickham's fire or repositioning to avoid the incoming rounds. The British infantry had advanced approximately 100 meters across no man's land and were approaching the German wire obstacles that would slow their advance and increase their vulnerability. Wickham resumed firing, directing bursts at additional German positions that were engaging the British attack. The 100-round magazine continued feeding reliably, each cartridge advancing through the spiral track and presenting itself to the bolt face as designed. At 24 seconds of cumulative firing time, approximately 168 rounds expended, the magazine was approaching exhaustion, but still contained sufficient ammunition for several additional bursts. The final rounds fed at 26 seconds of cumulative firing, at which point the magazine was empty and required replacement. Wickham had achieved 26 seconds of firing from a single magazine, more than 4 times the duration that a standard magazine would have provided. The tactical advantage was immediately obvious. During those 26 seconds, Wickham had delivered continuous suppressive fire without the interruption that magazine changes would have imposed, maintaining pressure on German positions throughout a critical phase of the British advance. However, the magazine change that followed revealed the handling penalties that accompanied the increased capacity. The empty 100-round magazine weighed approximately 1.2 kilograms, substantially more than an empty standard magazine, and its diameter made it awkward to remove from the weapon and set aside. Wickham fumbled slightly during the removal, consuming approximately 4 seconds more than a standard magazine change would have required. Mounting the replacement magazine, a standard 47-round design, proceeded normally, and Wickham resumed firing within approximately 14 seconds of the 100-round magazine's exhaustion. The extended magazine had provided a capacity advantage, but the handling penalties during magazine changes partially offset that advantage. The net effect was still favorable compared to standard magazines, but less dramatically so than the raw capacity numbers might suggest. The engagement continued for another 8 minutes as British forces pushed into the German trenches and German reserves counterattacked to restore their positions. Wickham expended a total of 11 magazines during the engagement, the single 100-round experimental magazine plus 10 standard 47-round magazines, for a total expenditure of approximately 570 rounds. His sustained fire had contributed to suppressing several German positions, though the overall tactical situation on the Somme front was developing unfavorably for British forces along most of the attack front. The after-action assessment that Wickham prepared during the following days documented both the advantages and limitations of the experimental magazine. The increased capacity had allowed sustained fire during critical moments, reducing the number of magazine changes required during the engagement from what would have been approximately 12 changes with standard magazines to 11 changes with 1 experimental and 10 standard magazines. The reduction of 1 magazine change saved approximately 10 to 12 seconds during the 8-minute engagement, a modest but potentially significant advantage during the specific moments that magazine was employed. However, Wickham also documented the handling difficulties created by the magazine's size and weight. The awkwardness of manipulating the enlarged magazine had partially offset the time saved by its increased capacity. Additionally, the magazine's diameter had created clearance problems when Wickham attempted to shift his firing position during the engagement, with the magazine contacting sandbags and requiring careful maneuvering to prevent dislodging it from the weapon. The weight issue proved particularly significant for the assistant gunner responsible for carrying spare magazines forward to the firing position. Standard 47-round magazines allowed the assistant to carry 4 to 6 loaded magazines in addition to other equipment, without excessive burden.
The 100-round magazine alone weighed as much as 2 standard magazines, and carrying multiple 100-round magazines would have been prohibitively burdensome for soldiers who also carried rifles, ammunition, entrenching tools, and other combat equipment. Wickham's report concluded that the 100-round magazine provided genuine tactical advantages during sustained defensive engagements, where the Lewis gun could be employed from prepared positions with adequate space for the enlarged magazine. However, the handling and weight penalties made the design unsuitable for mobile operations or for situations requiring frequent position changes. The report recommended limited adoption of the enlarged magazine for specific defensive scenarios while retaining standard magazines for general employment. The report reached the Small Arms Committee in London during August 1916, where it joined similar reports from 3 other Lewis gunners who had employed experimental 100-round magazines during the Somme offensive. The committee reviewed the accumulated field reports during September, noting that all 4 reports documented similar advantages and limitations. The consensus from field employment was that the enlarged magazine worked as intended, but imposed penalties that limited its tactical utility to specific scenarios. The committee's formal response, issued in October 1916, authorized limited production of 100-round magazines for issue to selected Lewis gun sections in defensive positions. However, the authorization came with significant caveats. The enlarged magazines were to be manufactured only in quantities sufficient to provide 1 or 2 examples per Lewis gun section, with standard 47-round magazines remaining the primary ammunition-carrying solution. The enlarged magazines were designated for use during sustained defensive engagements where their capacity advantages justified their handling penalties.
The limited production run produced approximately 2,400 100-round magazines between November 1916 and March 1917, manufactured at the Birmingham Small Arms Facility under contract to the War Office. The manufacturing process required specialized tooling to produce the extended spiral feed track with adequate precision, and quality control inspections rejected approximately 15% of completed magazines due to feeding track defects or spring problems. The magazines that passed inspection were distributed to British and Commonwealth forces on the Western Front during spring 1917, with priority allocation to divisions holding defensive sectors where German attacks were anticipated. Each Lewis gun section typically received 1 or 2 enlarged magazines, along with a dozen or more standard magazines, allowing gunners to employ the enlarged magazine during critical phases of defensive engagements while relying on standard magazines for routine operations. Field employment during 1917 confirmed the patterns that Wickham and other early users had documented. The enlarged magazine proved valuable during sustained defensive engagements, particularly during the initial phase of German attacks when continuous suppressive fire was most critical. However, the handling and weight made the enlarged magazine unpopular for mobile operations, and many sections left their 100-round magazines in rear areas when conducting offensive operations or patrols. The mechanical reliability of the production magazines varied considerably. Some gunners reported flawless operation through hundreds of loading and firing cycles, while others experienced frequent feeding failures that rendered the magazines unreliable. The feeding problems typically originated from spring fatigue or from damage to the spiral feed track caused by rough handling or debris intrusion.